Hi guys, my name is Mr. Lead, and today we're going to be talking about the nervous system. Alongside the endocrine system, this is one of the two body systems that our body uses to coordinate itself, to talk to itself, to tell itself what to do. So what's important to know about the nervous system is that it involves, or it can be split up into two different sections, two main sections. The central nervous system, which involves the brain and the spinal cord. So brain is here, spinal cord here. And the peripheral nervous system, which involves everything else, all the other nerves in your system. Now, the key, this is really key, the fact that we got these two split up. You can abbreviate the central nervous system to the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system is unfortunately abbreviated to the PNS. But anyway, what you've got to understand about the nervous system is that, unlike the endocrine system, the nervous system helps communicate to the body through electrical signals. The endocrine system, on the other hand, communicates through chemical messengers. Now, these electrical signals are sent through neurons or nerve cells. You can use these two terms interchangeably. These neurons, what you got to know, they're just like cells. They're just cells like any other, but these cells have very specialized organelles. They have these organelles called dendrites, axons, axon terminals, as well as myelin sheath, and it's also got something called a soma. You do need to know these 5 terms of what makes up a nerve cell. These are very key to understanding how nerve cells work. But yeah, aside from that, they still have all the other organelles that are found in animal cells, like mitochondria and ribosomes, etc. Anyway, so what you got to know about nerve cells is that you can split off nerve cells into 3 main categories. There are 3 different types of nerve cells or neurons. The first one is sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are linked to receptors. Sensory neurons feature receptors. In fact, that's part of what sensory neurons have. Sorry, this is the sensory neuron. So yeah, these receptor cells. Say, for example, you got rods and cones that help detect light, or you got some cells that help us hear, cells that help us smell, taste, touch, feel heat, etc. All these receptors are linked to these sensory cells, so these receptors help us pick up our senses, and they help us sense things. They're good for us to detect our 5 senses. Well, technically, if you want to get technical, our body actually has more than 5 senses. For example, we have the sense of heat, we have the sense of pressure, we've got the sense of pain. There's more than 5 senses. But nevertheless, these senses are picked up by the sensory neuron, and they're sent down. They're sent down the sensory neuron to the connector neurons. Connector neurons basically. They're the middleman between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, and connector neurons are specifically found in the CNS, while these two are found in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. So connector neurons, they transmit messages between these two, and then the motor neurons are the ones that connect the central nervous system back to effectors. Effectors are what carry out certain actions. You can either have muscles that make something move, or glands which secrete hormones for the endocrine system. We have this when you put all this together, you've got this sort of chain of events where you've got sensory neurons that pick up senses from the receptor cells, which send messages to the connector neurons, which send messages to the motor neurons, which send messages to the effectors to carry out some sort of task. Now, what you've got to know about the nerve cells is that you've got to understand, firstly, how nerve cells work. And this is very key. Understanding how nerve cells work, or how neurons work, helps you to understand just how your brain works and why your brain can function in certain ways it does. Neurons or nerve cells, what you understand is that they're all connected in this sort of chain, you could say. And electrical signals are only ever sent down one direction, down a neuron. So an electrical signal will come in at the dendrites, which will be sent to the soma. The soma is basically just the main body of the neuron, or the nerve cell. So electrical signal is sent to the dendrites, which are sent to the soma, which is sent down the axon. This is the axon here, which is sent to the axon terminals. And the axon terminals then sends that electrical signal to the next neuron, which goes to the dendrites, which goes to the soma, and so on and so on. The chain of events repeats. What's really key to understanding how nerve cells work, though, is that dendrites and axon terminals are not touching. They're not physically touching each other. There is a gap between them called the synapse. This is a really, really key thing to note. Let's say, for example, if we're talking about an electrical circuit, say with a battery and a light bulb and wires connecting them, if that electrical circuit was a closed circuit, so it was always connected, you would always see the current flowing through that circuit until it no longer has any power, no longer has any voltage. So yeah, you would constantly see that current being flown through. But that's a problem, because then you can't send the certain messages that you want. The light bulb will always stay on, and if you ever want it off, you need to close the circuit. So if we have all our neurons connected up and permanently connected all the time, that's a problem, because that means our nerve cells will constantly be sending messages to each other all the time. And that we'll never see them stop sending messages, and we'll never see them slow down messages or yet to send specific messages. So what we need is to send these electrical signals across. We need this gap between it. Gap between the dendrites and the axon terminals, so that we can control the messages that we send across. And this gap needs to be facilitated with something called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that our nerve cells create to help send a message across the gap. Basically, these neurotransmitters are created and they're sent down to the axon terminals, and they're sort of sent across the gap of the synapse, and then they just slowly brought back for the next time they needed to be sent across. Look, if we're talking about how things work at the synapse, there's actually a lot more that goes on there, but that's the basic detail of what happens. And what you're going to understand is you probably have heard of some certain neurotransmitters before, say, for example, dopamine or adrenaline. These neurotransmitters, the nerve cells will send certain neurotransmitters when it needs to convey certain information or certain messages. For example, we'll see more dopamine neurotransmitters being sent across when the brain is wanting to send messages of pleasure. But if your nerve cells are not actually producing enough neurotransmitters to be sent across these synapses, then that means the information carried across the nerve cells is not going to be as efficient. That's going to cause problems, and that can cause certain mental disabilities or mental disorders. Okay, so the last thing you got to know about nerve cells, though, is that there's something else, another part called myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is this coating that exists around the axon, and this coating, they're also called Schwann cells, by the way. But yeah, this coating it's this fatty coating that helps insulate the axon, and it helps the electrical signals being sent faster and more efficiently. So if you're seeing a really healthy nerve cells or a really healthy brain, you'll see lots of this myelin sheath, which means you'll see a very white brain. But if you're not seeing much of much of this myelin sheath, you're not going to see the nerve cells being carrying messages very efficiently or very fast. All right, now let's quickly talk about how our body responds to stimuli. When I talked about nerves, the different types of nerve cells, I mentioned how there's this sort of chain of events that occurs where you pick up a sense, you pick up a stimuli with the receptors, and that chain of events occurs. That chain of events goes like this. So you pick up some sort of stimulus, say for example, heat can be a stimulus. That stimulus is picked up by your receptor cells, say for example, temperature receptors in the skin, and those receptor cells are linked and connected to sensory neurons or sensory nerve cells, and those sensory nerve cells then are connected to the CNS, the central nervous system. So the brainstem. So they're sent to the brainstem, which could then be sent to the brain, then back to the brainstem, and then that will then be sent to motor neurons cells to then tell certain effectors. Say in this case, will tell some sweat glands or the muscles in our arms to do things, which will emit a certain response, i.e. you'll see more sweating, or you'll see yourself take off a jumper. So with this chain of events, it seems like a very normal chain of events that our body uses. However, there is a problem with this chain of events, and that is sometimes it's not fast enough. Our body sometimes is not quick enough at sending messages right to the brain and then right back down to the effectors to respond to a certain stimuli. And this is where we see a difference between voluntary actions and involuntary actions. All right, so think about this. When you touch a flame, your hand, if you're accidentally going to touch a flame, your hand is going to immediately move away. And it usually moves away faster than you can even think about moving your hand away. It's like it does it automatically. And the reason for this is because your brain is not actually being told your brain is not actually telling your body to move your hand away. So when we have an emergency situation where we need to quickly give a response to something, say for example a dangerous situation where we're touching a match, where we're touching a flame, the sensory neurons the typical chain of events will occur where the receptor cells, heat cells in our skin will be stimulated, which will then tell the sensory neurons to send a message to the central nervous system. But when it reaches the central nervous system, so i.e. when it reaches the spinal cord, the message is not sent right up to the brain and for the brain to figure out what to do. Because that takes too long. To be really fast, when it's an emergency situation, the spinal cord will take care of the response. So in the case of when you're feeling something that's too hot, the spinal cord will be like, whoa, hang on, this is an emergency situation. I'll take care of this brain, and it'll tell the muscles to do a certain action, or tell the motor neurons to do a certain action, which will tell the effectors, say the muscles, to move your hand away. And so, this is an involuntary response, and this specific involuntary response is known as a reflex. Reflexes occur when you do something without consciously thinking about it, without that decision making involved. So the entire chain of events, though, when we're talking about you reacting, your stimuli reacting to the receptors, which then tell the sensory neurons to tell the connector neurons, which tell the motor neurons to tell an effector what to do. That whole chain of events, though, is called a reflex arc. That's a really key term to know. I've seen teachers or parents play a certain game with students where they will hold a Freddo like this, and the students will have their hands here, and they will drop the Freddo at any given time without warning, and the students will have to grab it. And if they grab it, they get to keep the Freddo. Now, the reason why students usually really fail at this activity and fail at grabbing the Freddo is because we're seeing an example of a voluntary action, which is a much slower action. We're seeing the receptors, our eyes, being told, oh, hey, the Freddo's being moved. So that we'll see the sensory neurons send a message to our brain, and then the brain will have to try and process this information to tell the motor neurons to, hey, grab that Freddo. And usually this whole motion is very slow because it involves conscious thought. And conscious thought involves so many different neurons connecting to each other over so many different pathways. And because it's not one continuous, simple pathway like you see in a reflex arc, that's why decision making and voluntary actions are usually much slower. let's try and visualize this a little bit better. So in a reflex arc, we have the receptor connecting to the sensory neuron, which connects to the interneurons or the connector neurons, which connects to the motor neuron and to the muscle. By the way, usually there's actually just one long sensory neuron that connects a receptor to the spinal cord. It's just one long neuron. It's not a whole chain of neurons, and it's the same for motor neurons. But yeah, that's the thing. With the spinal cord, we usually only have one or two connector neurons here. So see, this is just one connector neuron here. But when we're having to decide something or using our brain or thought for something, then it's a lot harder because the sensory neurons are connected to the brain, and there's so many connector neurons in the brain. So it's having to try and find the right path to take to get to the motor neurons and to get to the effector. So that's why it takes so much longer to be able to respond and catch the Freddo dropping. We're not used we're not as used to it because there's so many neurons, and the path is so much more complicated. But we can make the path simpler if, sorry, my pen's really spazzing out here. If we can make the path simpler if we practice, and if the neurons get practice being fired at a certain rate. So if these neurons get practice at, if certain neurons get more and more used to being fired and sending signals down certain paths, they're going to do it much quicker and much more naturally. And so this is why the more you practice something, the easier it is to do that thing. Because you're creating these very solid neural pathways within your brain, where your nerve cells are automatically used to firing in a certain way, so that a voluntary action becomes more and more involuntary. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the brain. We can actually see our brain through something called an MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. So this is a good tool that helps us pick up, say, tumors or brain injuries, and it can also help us diagnose strokes. Fun fact, I actually had an MRI once when I was younger. I'm not sure if you can really see some of the, yeah, there. That's my brain, guys. There you go, that's my brain. Anyway, yeah, the brain controls and regulates all the functions in our body. We're going to talk about the major sections of the brain. This is something you do need to remember. The first major section of the brain is the cerebrum. So this is actually, when you think of the brain, this is the main part of the brain you probably think of. It consists of 80% of the brain. So all of this is the cerebrum. Then we've got other parts here, but we'll talk about those in a moment. This is all the cerebrum, and it contains a lot of folds, and these folds, like it's all you see it all be wrinkly, but these wrinkles are all actually called folds. There's an advantage to having lots of folds, and yeah, if you look at different types of animals, you'll see that animals that are considered more intelligent typically have more folds in their brains. That's because the benefit of having more folds means you have more surface area in your brain, which means you have more spots for neurons to be connecting to each other. And remember, like we talked before, you want more neurons to be connecting to each other to be able to send messages throughout the brain faster. So the more folds you have, the more surface area you have, which means, your brain will work more efficiently. The cerebrum is split into two halves. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, both of these, the cerebrum helps with sensing things, or at least it picks up and processes sensory information, and it also sends information to the motor cells. But what's interesting to know is the left side of the brain actually sends information to the right side, and the right side of the brain actually sends information to the left side. So yeah, each part of the brain actually controls the separate side of the body. But also these parts of the brain are responsible for different things as well. For example, the left hemisphere is important for comprehending speech and making speech, comprehending language. It's also used a lot for calculations and thinking and analyzing and sequencing and recognizing patterns and words, while the right hemisphere is much more used for creativity and for spatial awareness and to understand context and perception and recognizing faces and places and objects. We can actually, we've been able to map with an MRI where different parts of the brain generally get used for different things. But yeah, we see that these two sides of the brain function in these different ways. Okay, so the next part of the brain is the cerebellum. Just really quickly, the cerebellum is this bit down here, and it's responsible for balance and coordination. That's the main thing you've got to know about the cerebellum. It's this large chunk down here. It doesn't really look all foldy like the rest of the brain. And the last part about the brain you need to know is the brainstem. The brainstem is what connects the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, so the brainstem and the spinal cord, they're different things. Now, you are technically going to be able to function and survive without the rest of the brain. But the brainstem, you cannot live without because the brainstem controls breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. These are some involuntary actions. So that's actions that we don't consciously think about. These are involuntary actions that our brain just naturally, that our brainstem just naturally takes care of and just naturally works away at. And the main part of the brainstem that connects the brainstem to the spinal cord is called the medulla. The medulla is this part right down here. So all of this is the brainstem, and this bottom part of the brainstem is the medulla. And the brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. Damaging this is fatal. Damaging the rest of the brain is not as bad, but still bad. I mean, any damage to the brain at all is generally bad. Anyway, the last part you've got to know about with the nervous system is how we protect our nervous system, specifically how we protect the central nervous system. We protect it with what's known as the cranium and the vertebrae. You probably know these things as the skull and the spine, but those are very generalized terms that we don't really use as much in science. In science, we refer to this as the cranium, and we refer to this as the vertebrae. The brain is kept inside the cranium, and it's suspended in something called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And this helps act as like a buffer and absorbs shock, and it also provides nutrients to the brain. The brainstem is just the spinal cord is just the same. It's kept inside the spine, and it's provided, and it consists of, or it's surrounded by cerebral or spinal fluid as well. Okay, so we have just talked about the brain and the brainstem and neurons and everything about the nervous system. So, hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.